Marcus Bell had learned a long time ago that the first 10 minutes of any school day were the most dangerous, because that was when everyone could still see what you were wearing before the classroom settled into lessons and the shoes under the desks disappeared from view. And on that particular Tuesday morning in October, Marcus stood at the door of room 204, wearing the same sneakers he had worn every day for the past 8 months. Sneakers that had once been white and were now the color of old newspaper. Sneakers with a split seam along the left toe that he had glued shut 3 times already. Sneakers that his father, Daniel Bell, had bought 2 sizes too big on purpose so Marcus could grow into them, because that was what you did when you worked 2 jobs and raised a son alone, and every single dollar had somewhere else it needed to go before it could go to a shoe store. And Marcus knew the shoes were falling apart. He knew it every morning when he laced them, but he had never once complained to his father because he had watched his father come home at 11 at night, smelling like the warehouse, and then get up again at 5 for the second job at the auto shop. And a boy who watched that could not bring himself to ask for anything that wasn't already being given. So Marcus walked into English class with his shoulders a little forward and his eyes on the floor, hoping the way he always hoped that nobody would look down. And for the first 20 minutes of class, nobody did, because Mrs. Diane Whitfield was busy writing vocabulary words on the whiteboard in her sharp, slanted handwriting, words like integrity and perseverance. And Marcus copied them into his notebook and thought, not for the first time, that those words felt like they belonged to a different kind of life than the one he was living. And then Mrs. Whitfield asked the class to stand up 1 row at a time and come to the front to read their assigned paragraphs aloud, an exercise she called public speaking practice. And when it was Marcus's row's turn, he stood up along with the 4 other students in his row and walked toward the front of the classroom. And it was there, in the open space between the desks and the whiteboard, with 30 pairs of eyes free to look anywhere they wanted, that Mrs. Whitfield's gaze drifted down to his feet and stopped, and she said, in a voice pitched just loud enough to travel to the back row, "Well now, Marcus, did you dress yourself out of a dumpster this morning?" And for 1 full second, the room was silent in the particular way a room goes silent right before it decides whether to laugh, and then it decided, and it laughed. Not everyone, but enough. Enough that the sound of it filled the space where Marcus's voice should have been, and Mrs. Whitfield smiled the small, satisfied smile of someone who believes she has made a clever joke rather than delivered a wound. And she said, "I mean it. Look at those things. They look like they walked here on their own." And a boy named Tyler in the second row said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Bro, those are held together with prayer." And the laughter rose again, and Marcus stood there in the open space at the front of the room with his paragraph about the Industrial Revolution still folded in his hand, and he did not read it because his throat had closed around something he did not have a name for yet, something that was not quite shame and not quite anger, but sat exactly between the two. And Mrs. Whitfield, perhaps sensing that she had crossed further than she meant to, or perhaps not sensing anything at all, said, all right, settle down, Marcus. You can read from where you're standing." And Marcus read the paragraph in a voice so flat and so quiet that the teacher had to ask him twice to speak up. And when he finally sat back down, he kept his feet tucked as far under his desk as they would go for the rest of the period. And that might have been the end of it. One more small cruelty absorbed into the long list of small cruelties that make up a hard year. Except that Marcus's best friend, a girl named Priya Anand, who sat 2 seats to his left, had pulled out her phone during the reading and, without really thinking about what she was doing, had recorded 11 seconds of the moment. The 11 seconds that captured Mrs. Whitfield's voice, saying the words about the dumpster, and the class laughing, and Tyler's comment about prayer. And Priya did not show it to Marcus that day, because she did not want to make it worse, but she did not delete it either. She just let it sit in her phone a small stone she was not yet sure what to do with. And that night, Marcus went home the way he always went home, taking the long route past the gas station instead of the short route past the school buses, because the long route meant he did not have to hear anyone else comment on his shoes on the walk. And when he got to the apartment, his father was not there yet, would not be there for another 2 hours. So Marcus sat at the kitchen table and did his homework and did not tell anyone what had happened, because telling his father would mean his father would worry, and his father already carried enough weight without adding a wound that Marcus told himself he could carry on his own. And this was the first mistake in a story that was about to become much bigger than either of them understood, because silence, when it comes from a child trying to protect a parent, has a way of curdling into something the parent discovers far too late. And Daniel Bell did not find out about the classroom that day, or the next day, or the day after that. He only noticed, in the small, observant way that tired fathers notice things, that Marcus had started coming home later, taking longer routes, saying less at dinner, pulling his sleeves down over his hands, even though it was not yet cold enough to need it. And Daniel filed these small changes away the way he filed away most things lately, as something to look into once things settled down, except things at the warehouse were not settling down. They were getting harder, because Daniel Bell had a second life that Marcus knew almost nothing about. A life that had begun 11 months earlier, when a community organization in their neighborhood called Fairground Coalition had gone door to door asking parents about their experiences with the local school district. And Daniel, exhausted as he was, had answered the door and talked for 40 minutes about how his son's school had cut the free breakfast program the year before, about how the textbooks were 9 years out of date, about how 3 of the best teachers had left in the last 2 years because the district would not fund their positions properly, and the woman collecting the stories, a retired principal named Carol Simmons, had listened to every word, and then asked Daniel a question nobody had ever asked him before. She asked if he would consider running for the open community seat on the district's school board, a seat set aside specifically for a parent representative. And Daniel had laughed at first, because he was a man who worked 2 jobs and slept 5 hours a night, and did not see how there was room in that life for one more thing. But Carol Simmons had looked at him with the patience of someone who had spent 30 years believing that the right people rarely believe they are the right people. And she said, "Mr. Bell, the seat exists so that a parent like you has a voice in that building. Not so that another person who has never packed a school lunch on $4 gets to decide what your son eats." And something about the way she said it stayed with Daniel for weeks, until finally, on a night when Marcus was asleep and the apartment was quiet, Daniel filled out the paperwork at the kitchen table under the same light Marcus did his homework under. And he did not tell Marcus, not because he was hiding it, but because the seat was not guaranteed. There was an election, there was a process, and Daniel did not want to raise his son's hopes about anything that might not happen. And for 11 months, Daniel Bell lived 2 lives, the warehouse and the auto shop by day, and in whatever hours were left, community meetings, budget hearings, a campaign that consisted mostly of him knocking on doors after his shifts, still wearing his work boots. And slowly, unbelievably to him, the parent representative seat on the district school board became his, confirmed in a small ceremony in August that Marcus did not attend because Daniel had told him it was just a work thing, a small lie born entirely out of a father's instinct to protect his son from disappointment in case it fell through, and even after it did not fall through. Even after Daniel Bell became a sworn member of the district school board with full voting rights on curriculum, staffing, and yes, teacher conduct, he still had not found the right moment to tell Marcus, partly because the board did not begin its official visits to individual schools until the fall semester was underway, and partly, if Daniel was honest with himself, because some quiet part of him wanted to walk into his son's school as an ordinary parent. One more time before he had to walk in as something else, And that quiet, understandable delay was about to collide with the 11 seconds of video still sitting untouched in Priya Anand's phone. Because 2 weeks after the incident in Mrs. Whitfield's classroom, Priya's older sister, home from college for the weekend, saw the video by accident while scrolling through Priya's phone looking for a family photo, and she asked Priya what it was. And Priya, finally given a reason to say the thing she had been sitting on for 2 weeks, told her sister everything, about the shoes, about the laughing, about how Marcus had not said a single word about it since. And Priya's sister, who had spent the last 2 years of college studying education policy and who understood exactly what kind of thing this was, told Priya that this was not something to sit on any longer, that a video like this needed to go to someone who could actually do something. And together, they looked up the district's reporting procedures and found, printed right there on the district website, a list of school board members with a note that said, "Any parent, guardian, or student with a concern about staff conduct could request a direct meeting with their board representative." And there, third on the list, was a name Priya recognized immediately: Daniel Bell, parent representative. And Priya sat very still for a long moment, because she realized, with the particular clarity that only a 13-year-old can have about the world when the pieces suddenly line up, that the man on that list was Marcus's father. And she told her sister, "That's him. That's Marcus's dad." And her sister said, "Then that is exactly where this needs to go." And so, without telling Marcus, because she was afraid of how he would react if he found out before it was handled, Priya asked her own mother to help her write a short, careful email. And that email was sent to the General District Board inbox with a request that it be forwarded to board member Bell, specifically regarding an incident involving his son. And it sat in a queue for 2 days before it reached Daniel's district email account, an account he checked far less often than he should have, because he was still learning to be a school board member in the cracks of a life built for 2 other jobs. And on a Thursday night, after his shift at the auto shop, sitting in his truck in the parking lot because the cab was quieter than the apartment would be once he walked inside, Daniel opened his phone and read the email from a woman named Reena Anand on behalf of her daughter Priya, and he read the words "public speaking exercise" and "Mrs. Whitfield" and "dumpster comment" and "video attached." And he opened the video, and he watched 11 seconds of his son standing in front of a classroom with a paragraph folded in his hand. Watched the exact moment a teacher looked at his son's shoes, the shoes Daniel himself had bought, 2 sizes too big, on purpose, because that was all he could do, and said the word "dumpster" in front of 30 children. And Daniel Bell sat in his truck in the dark parking lot of an auto shop and watched his son's face on an 11-second video 4 times in a row, and something in him that had been holding very still for a very long time did not break. Exactly. But it set, the way concrete sets, into something hard and permanent and absolutely clear. And he did not go home angry that night. He went home quiet, and he sat across from Marcus at the kitchen table while his son did math homework, and he asked, in the gentlest voice he owned, if anything had happened at school lately that Marcus wanted to talk about. And Marcus, who had spent 2 weeks building a wall around the memory specifically so his father would never have to know it existed, said no, nothing, school's fine. And Daniel nodded and did not push, because he understood, in that moment, something important. That his son had chosen silence not out of shame in himself, but out of love for his father, out of a boy's instinct to shield a man who was already carrying too much. And that understanding did not soften what Daniel felt about Mrs. Whitfield. If anything, it sharpened it, because now he understood exactly what his son had swallowed alone for 2 weeks, rather than add one more weight to his father's shoulders. And Daniel decided that night, sitting across the table from a boy doing algebra in shoes with a glued seam, that he was not going to handle this quietly through paperwork and procedure alone. He was going to make sure that the moment landed the way it needed to land. Not for revenge. Daniel was not a man built for revenge, but for something closer to correction. The kind of correction that only happens when the people responsible are made to see, plainly and without room to explain it away, exactly what they did. And so Daniel Bell began making calls, first to Carol Simmons, who by now had become something between a mentor and a friend, and then to the district superintendent's office. And he learned that the board's regular fall schedule already included site visits to each middle school in the district. Unannounced walkthroughs meant to observe classroom conditions and staff performance firsthand, and Marcus's school, Jefferson Middle School, was scheduled for a visit in exactly 9 days, and Daniel requested, formally in writing, that he personally be assigned to conduct the observation of the English department that day, a request that was well within his rights as a board member and raised no particular flags with the superintendent's office, because board members observing classrooms was simply part of the job. And for 9 days, Daniel Bell went to work at the warehouse and the auto shop exactly as he always had, and came home and made dinner and helped Marcus with homework exactly as he always had, and said nothing about what was coming, because he understood that if he told Marcus in advance, Marcus would spend 9 days in dread, and Daniel wanted to give his son 9 more ordinary days before anything changed. And on the morning of the 9th day, a bright, cold Wednesday in November, Marcus woke up and put on the same worn sneakers he had been putting on for 8 months, unaware that his father, 3 miles away, was standing in front of a mirror in a suit jacket Daniel had bought secondhand, specifically for board meetings, clipping a small laminated badge to his lapel, a badge that read, Daniel Bell, District 5, Community Representative, Jefferson Independent School Board. And Daniel looked at that badge in the mirror for a long moment before he left the apartment. Not with pride exactly, though there was pride in it, but with the steady, focused calm of a man about to do something he had been preparing for without fully realizing he was preparing for it. And he drove to Jefferson Middle School and checked in at the front office the way any board member would, and the front office staff, a woman named Ms. Alvarez, who had worked there for 11 years and had never once seen a board member arrive unannounced, greeted him with the polite scramble reserved for unexpected authority, and Daniel told her simply that he would be observing the English department that morning as part of the district's fall walk-through schedule. And Ms. Alvarez walked him toward the hallway that led to room 204 and told him, as she walked, that second period English with Mrs. Whitfield was just about to begin. And Daniel said nothing to that, only nodded. And inside room 204, Marcus Bell sat down at his desk, exactly as he had every day for the past 8 months, folding his feet slightly under his chair out of habit now, a habit he had developed without even fully noticing he had developed it. And Mrs. Whitfield began the period the way she began most periods, brisk and efficient, moving straight into the day's grammar lesson. And Marcus had almost let himself relax into the rhythm of an ordinary class when there was a knock at the door, and Ms. Alvarez leaned in and said, Mrs. Whitfield, sorry to interrupt. You have a board observation this morning. And Mrs. Whitfield, who had had exactly 0 notice of this, and whose face flickered for half a second with the particular anxiety of someone unprepared for an audit, straightened her blouse and said, Of course, please. Come in. And the door opened, and Daniel Bell stepped into the classroom wearing his second-hand suit jacket and his laminated badge. And for 1 full second, Marcus Bell looked up from his desk and did not understand what he was seeing, because his brain, still half in the rhythm of grammar exercises, needed a moment to process the fact that his father was standing at the front of his English classroom, not in his warehouse uniform, not in his auto shop coveralls, but in a jacket Marcus had never seen before, with a badge on his lapel that Marcus could not yet read from across the room, and Mrs. Whitfield, entirely unaware of what she was standing next to, gestured toward an empty chair at the side of the room, and said, "Please, Mr. Bell, feel free to observe from anywhere you'd like. We're in the middle of our grammar unit." And Daniel said, "Thank you," and walked toward the chair. And it was on that walk, that short walk across the front of the classroom, that his eyes found his son's face in the third row, and for just a moment that belonged only to the two of them and nobody else in the room, father and son looked at each other, Marcus with wide, confused, searching eyes, and Daniel with a small, steady nod, the kind of nod that meant, "It's all right. I've got this." And then Daniel sat down in the observer's chair at the side of the room, opened a small notebook, and began, quietly and without any outward sign of what he already knew, to watch, and the class continued. Mrs. Whitfield moved through her grammar lesson with the extra polish that teachers reserve for observation days, calling on students who she knew would answer well, praising responses a little more warmly than usual, and for 20 minutes, it seemed almost as though the day might pass without the moment Daniel had come for, until Mrs. Whitfield announced, exactly as she had 2 weeks before, that it was time for public speaking practice, row by row. And she called Marcus's row to the front, and Marcus, who had spent the last 2 weeks dreading this exact exercise and had somehow forgotten, in the shock of his father's arrival, that it was scheduled for today, stood up along with 4 other students and walked to the front of the room, his paragraph in his hand, and Daniel, sitting quietly in his observer's chair, felt his whole body go still, because he understood, with the sudden clarity of someone watching a scene he had already watched on a phone screen 4 times, exactly what was about to be tested. Not the grammar, but the teacher. And Mrs. Whitfield, moving through the row of students, asked each one to read. And when it came to Marcus's turn, Marcus unfolded his paragraph and began to read, his voice a little tighter than the others, but steady. And Daniel watched Mrs. Whitfield's eyes, and he saw the exact moment they drifted, the way they had drifted 2 weeks earlier, down toward his son's shoes, and he saw her mouth begin to open. And for one terrible half-second, Daniel thought she was actually going to say it again, in front of a board member, in front of everyone. And perhaps she nearly did. Perhaps the words were already halfway formed, because old habits of casual cruelty do not always announce themselves, even to the person carrying them. But whatever she had been about to say, she caught it, swallowed it, and said instead, in a voice slightly too bright, "Very good, Marcus. Nice, clear reading." And Marcus sat back down without incident. And to anyone else in the room, it would have looked like nothing at all had happened. A teacher glancing at a student, and then complimenting him, ordinary, forgettable. But Daniel Bell had seen exactly what he came to see. Not a repeat of the original cruelty, but the shape of it still sitting there under the surface, visible in the half-second before she caught herself. And more than that, he had watched his son's shoulders tense in anticipation of a blow that this time did not land. And that tension told Daniel everything he needed to know about how many times, in how many small ways, that particular fear had been rehearsed. And when the period ended and the students filed out for their next class, Marcus lingering for one confused, searching look back at his father before Ms. Alvarez gently guided him along with the flow of students into the hallway, Daniel stood, closed his small notebook, and said to Mrs. Whitfield, calmly, "Mrs. Whitfield, I wonder if you have a few minutes before your next class." And Mrs. Whitfield, sensing now that this had not been an ordinary observation, said of course, and Daniel closed the classroom door. And in the quiet of the now empty room, he opened his notebook and read aloud, word for word, from notes he had written after watching the video for the 4th time, the exact sentence she had said 2 weeks earlier. "Well now, Marcus, did you dress yourself out of a dumpster this morning?" And he watched the color drain from Mrs. Whitfield's face as she realized, in real time, that the board member standing in front of her, The man whose observation she had just performed for with extra polish was not simply a random parent representative, but was, specifically, unmistakably, the father of the child she had humiliated. And she began to speak, to explain, to say something about how it was meant as light-hearted, how she hadn't meant any harm by it. And Daniel let her finish, because he was not a man who believed in cutting people off, even people who deserved to be cut off. And when she was done, he said, quietly but without any softness left in his voice, "Mrs. Whitfield, my son wore those shoes for 8 months without telling me a single word about what happened in this room, not because he was ashamed of the shoes, but because he did not want to add one more worry onto a father who was already working 2 jobs to keep him fed." And Daniel let that sentence sit in the room for a moment before he continued, "I did not come here today as a parent asking for an apology, though I expect one will be part of what happens next. I came here today as a member of this district's school board, and what I witnessed in this classroom, both 2 weeks ago on video and again just now with my own eyes, is a pattern of conduct that this district does not tolerate." And Mrs. Whitfield, visibly shaking now, said she understood, and Daniel told her, calmly, that the matter would be referred through the district's formal conduct review process, that this was not a decision he was making alone or in anger, but one that would follow the same procedure applied to any staff member, a process that would include an investigation, an opportunity for her to respond formally, and a determination made not by him personally, but by the full review committee, because Daniel understood something important that he wanted to carry into every part of this new role. That fairness could not simply switch off the moment it became personal, and so even in the room where his own son had been hurt, he insisted on a process rather than a verdict. And he left the classroom that morning having done exactly what he came to do. Not shouted, not threatened, simply seen clearly and named clearly what had happened, and set in motion the machinery that existed precisely for moments like this one. And 3 weeks later, after a formal investigation that included statements from several students, the original 11-second video, and a review of Mrs. Whitfield's file, which revealed, uncomfortably, that this was not the first complaint filed about comments made towards students, though it was the first one that had been pursued to completion. The district's review committee reached its decision, and Mrs. Diane Whitfield was removed from her classroom position and reassigned pending further review. And the district announced, separately, a new mandatory training program for all staff on respectful classroom conduct, a program that Daniel Bell, in his role on the board, had specifically pushed to include real examples drawn, with permission and without naming names, from actual incidents in the district, because he believed that abstract rules rarely change behavior the way a real, specific, human story does. And on the evening the decision was finalized, Daniel came home and sat Marcus down at the kitchen table, the same table where Daniel had filled out board paperwork 11 months earlier without telling his son, the same table where Marcus had done algebra homework while carrying a secret he thought he was protecting his father from. And Daniel told Marcus everything: the community meetings, the election, the badge, the video Priya had sent, the classroom visit, all of it. And Marcus sat and listened with an expression that moved slowly from confusion to disbelief to something that looked almost like grief, because he said quietly, you knew, and you didn't say anything." And Daniel said, "I found out 3 weeks ago, and I'm sorry it took me that long. But Marcus, I need you to hear something else too. You carried this alone for 2 weeks before that, and you did it because you didn't want to give me one more thing to worry about. And Marcus, I need you to understand that there is nothing that could ever be too much for me to carry if it means you don't have to carry it alone." And Marcus, who had spent 8 months believing that his silence was a form of strength, a gift he was giving his exhausted father, sat at that table and cried. For the first time in longer than either of them could remember. Not because he was sad exactly, but because something he had been holding so tightly for so long had finally been allowed to set down. And Daniel held his son and said nothing for a long while, because some moments do not need more words added to them. And in the weeks that followed, Jefferson Middle School felt different. In small, specific ways that only the students who had lived through the old version could really measure, a new teacher took over the English classes, a young man named Mr. Osei, who made a point on his very first day of telling the class that nothing about a person's clothes or shoes or house or car had anything to do with their worth in that room. And Priya Anand, who had never told Marcus that she was the one who sent the video, finally told him the truth one afternoon on the walk home, bracing herself for him to be angry that she had gone behind his back. And Marcus, standing on the sidewalk in a brand new pair of sneakers his father had bought him, not out of guilt, but simply because it was time, looked at his best friend for a long moment and then said, "Thank you, because you did what I was too scared to do." And Priya, who had spent weeks worrying about exactly this conversation, felt something in her chest unclench. And as for Daniel Bell, he stayed on the school board for the rest of his term and then ran again, unopposed, because by then half the parents in the district knew his name and what he stood for, and he never once used what happened to Marcus as a talking point in any campaign, because he did not see it as a victory to be celebrated, only as a wound that had, eventually, through no small amount of courage from a 13-year-old girl with a phone and a father who refused to look away, been allowed to heal. And years later, when Marcus was applying to colleges and writing an essay about a moment that shaped him, he did not write about the shoes or the classroom or the laughter. He wrote instead about the exact second his father walked through that classroom door in a second-hand suit jacket, about looking up from his desk and understanding, for the first time in his life, that being seen by the person you love most in the world, fully and without flinching, is not a small thing. It is in fact one of the largest things a person can ever receive, and that some fathers show their love in warehouse shifts and auto shop hours and shoes bought 2 sizes too big, and some fathers, when it matters most, show it by walking into the one room where their child was made small and simply standing there, quietly, until the room remembers how to be fair again. And there is one more part of this story that deserves to be told, because it did not end with Mrs. Whitfield's removal or with the new training program or even with Marcus's college essay years later. It continued in quieter, smaller ways that never made it into any official district record, but mattered just as much, because a month after the decision was finalized, Daniel Bell received a letter at his district office, handwritten, from a woman named Yolanda Price, the mother of a boy named Deshaun, who had been in Mrs. Whitfield's class 2 years before Marcus. And the letter explained that Deshaun had also been mocked in that same classroom, mocked for a stutter he had worked years to manage, mocked so badly in front of his classmates that he had begged his mother to let him transfer schools. And Yolanda Price had filed a complaint at the time, a complaint that had gone nowhere, absorbed into a system that had no real mechanism for taking a single parent's word seriously against a tenured teacher. And Yolanda wrote that when she heard, through the parent grapevine that moves faster than any official announcement, that a board member named Bell had personally walked into that classroom and made sure the matter could not be buried again, she wanted him to know that her son, now in high school and doing well, had asked her to write the letter, because Deshaun wanted somebody to know that what happened to Marcus had happened to him too, and that it mattered to him that this time, finally, someone had not let it slide. And Daniel read that letter standing in his kitchen with his work boots still on, and he understood then, more fully than he had understood even in the classroom that day, that what he had done for his son had also, without his fully intending it, been done for a boy he had never met. And he kept that letter folded in his wallet from that day forward, not to remind himself of anger, but to remind himself of why the work mattered even on the nights when he was too tired to attend one more meeting. And there was another thread to this story, too, one that unfolded more slowly, involving Mrs. Whitfield herself, because the district's process, being what it was, did not simply erase her from existence. It removed her from the classroom and placed her, after a mandatory period of retraining and reflection, into an administrative role that kept her away from direct student contact. And 8 months after the incident, Daniel received an email from her. Not an email he was required to answer, not part of any formal process, simply a message she had chosen to send on her own. And in it, she wrote that she had spent those 8 months thinking, really thinking, about the shape of the comment she had made, and the years of smaller comments before it that she had never once considered worth examining. And she wrote that she was not writing to ask for her old position back, because she understood she had not earned that. But she wanted Daniel to know that she had begun volunteering, on her own time, with a local literacy program for children in exactly the kind of household Marcus came from, not as an act of penance designed to be seen, she wrote, but because watching that 11-second video of herself, over and over, during the review process, had shown her a version of herself she did not want to remain. And Daniel read that email twice and did not reply for several days, because he was not interested in absolving anyone quickly or in mistaking a good sentence for genuine change. But eventually he wrote back 3 lines, thanking her for the update, telling her that actions sustained over years mattered more than any single email, and wishing her well in whatever she chose to build from here. And he never heard from her again, though twice, over the following 2 years, he heard secondhand from other parents that she was still volunteering at that same literacy program, quietly, without any fanfare. And Daniel decided that this, too, whatever it was worth, was a kind of ending that mattered, not a redemption arc handed to her for free, but evidence that consequences, applied fairly and followed through completely, can sometimes open a door in a person that shame alone never could. And back at Jefferson Middle School, the culture Mr. Osei began building in that classroom rippled outward in ways nobody could have planned. Because Mr. Osei started a small after-school program he called Reading Without Judgment, where students could bring any book from home, no matter how tattered, no matter how far below or above grade level, and simply read together in a circle of mismatched chairs. And Mark joined that program not because he needed extra reading help, but because he wanted to be in a room built on the opposite principle of the one that had hurt him. And it was in that room, 2 years later, that a new 7th grader named Aaliyah, wearing shoes with a hole starting at the little toe, sat quietly in the circle on her first day, clearly bracing herself the way Marcus once had, waiting for someone to notice and say something cruel. And Marcus, without making a show of it, without even fully planning to, sat down in the chair next to her and asked her what book she had brought. And when she showed him, hesitant, expecting mockery, he told her honestly that it was one of his favorites too, and the tension in her shoulders eased, just slightly, the exact way Marcus's own shoulders had once tensed and never fully learned to relax until his father walked through that classroom door. And Marcus understood, watching Aaliyah slowly settle into the circle, that this was the actual ending of the story, not the punishment of one teacher or the promotion of one father to one board seat. But this, a room where a kid with broken shoes did not have to wonder whether today was the day someone would decide his shoes were worth more attention than his mind. And years later, when people in the neighborhood told the story of Daniel Bell walking into that classroom in a second-hand suit, they usually ended it there, at the door, at the moment of the reveal, because that was the part that made for a good story. The twist, the badge, the shock on the teacher's face. But Marcus, whenever he heard people tell it that way, would gently correct them. Because for him, the story never really ended at the door. It ended in the reading circle 2 years later, in the quiet, unremarkable act of one formerly frightened kid making a little room for another. And if there was a lesson in all of it, a lesson Marcus carried with him long after he left Jefferson Middle School for high school, and eventually for college, on the strength of an essay about being seen, it was this: that dignity is rarely restored in one dramatic moment. No matter how satisfying that moment feels to witness, dignity is restored slowly, through the accumulation of 100 smaller moments that come after. A father who finally lets his son see how much he is loved. A friend who finds the courage to send an evidence she was afraid to send. A new teacher who sets a different tone on day one. A boy who once needed someone to notice his shoes and grew into someone who noticed someone else's instead. And that is the truth this story leaves behind. Not simply that a teacher was held accountable, though she was, and not simply that a father turned out to have more power than anyone expected, though he did, but that every child sitting quietly with their shoulders tucked forward, hoping nobody looks down, deserves a room, eventually, where nobody does.